I've chosen a few readings from the New Testament this morning that speak about the notion of the cross, and I'm going to be talking about that in the homily. From Matthew chapter 16. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." From Mark's Gospel. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. From 1 Corinthians. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. From Galatians. May I never boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, through which the world has been crucified to me, and I to the world. And finally from Colossians, having cancelled the charge of our legal indebtedness, which stood against us and condemned us, he has taken it away, nailing it to the cross. These are words inspired by God. So the theme I've chosen for today, I'd call it the spirituality of crosses and spirals. And so I'm going to be addressing two main topics today. The first one is the various symbolisms of the cross. What does the cross represent in different symbolic systems? And then secondly, I want to look at the symbolism of the spiral in many different versions. So I'll give very many different versions of each of these two symbols. So let me talk about the symbolism of the cross for me. I'm coming from an Irish background. The Celtic cross is a very important symbol of the cross for us Celts. And the Celtic cross is, as you know, it's a cross, but there's a circle around the top of it. So it's both a circle and a cross, because it symbolizes joining heaven to earth in the circuit of eternal life. So the vertical and horizontal arms of the cross represent, the earth itself, the connection between heaven and earth, and then the circle represents the circuit of eternal life, from before we're born to life, to after we die, to when we incarnate. So there are very many different versions of the cross for me. And the first version I want to talk about is kind of the one we're most familiar with. It's the cross of crucifixion. And we think that this is basically an instrument of torture, and indeed it was. But that for me is not the chief significance of crucifixion, the cross of crucifixion. When I see the cross of crucifixion, I see the vertical arm for me represents the connection between the transcendence of God and the immanence of God, the ineffable mystery, and then the creative element of it. And when I see the horizontal version, arm of the cross, it represents for me what native peoples in this continent call all my relationships, my connection with everything. There are the stone people, the plant people, the bird people, the four-legged creatures, the six-legged creatures, the 100-legged creatures, the 1,000-legged creatures, all my relations. And so for me, the cross of crucifixion is where the transcendence of God meets our immanence, and where all my relations, my connection to all of my relations. And then the intersection is at the heart space. It is the meeting place where wisdom and compassion meet the crucifixion of third-dimensional incarnation. So that for me is one symbol of the cross of crucifixion. There's another version of the cross that I call the cross of resurrection. And this had to do with the conundrum facing the early disciples after they had witnessed the risen Jesus. And they're trying to explain to people that it really was he, they saw him. So they got two problems. Firstly, they have to show that it really was the same before and after, but there was something different. He was transformed in some way. So the below above is the realization that he was transformed, that the Jesus they encountered after his resurrection, he was transformed in some way. So initially, they didn't even recognize him. Mary of Magdala thought he was the gardener. The two disciples on the road to Emmaus had a complete conversation with him and didn't recognize him until they broke bread together and they recognized him in the Eucharist. So that, I would call that the below above. He's transformed in some way. And then the before after is the horizontal arm of the cross. They're really trying to say it really is the same Jesus. He ate with us. He showed us his hands and his side. And so it really was he. So the Jesus before and the Jesus after his resurrection was the same Jesus. But he was transformed. So now you've got a cross of resurrection. There's another version of the cross that came up just a few months ago. And this is an X-shaped cross. So everything above the horizontal has to do with the transcendence of God, and everything below the center has to do with the immanence of God. But there are two spokes above and two spokes below. So for me, at the top, one part of the X represents the transcendence, the father figure, which is love. And the other side above represents the mother figure, our light, our Sophia consciousness. So now above both transcendence, you have a father version of transcendence, you've got a mother version of transcendence, light and Sophia, and for the father, love. And then below, the bottom part of the X for me, is the immanence of God. So on one side, you've got the male, incarnation of the divine, the Christ figure or the Logos figure. And at the other side, you've got the female, the life principle of what I call Christa consciousness. So now for me, that's a totally different version of the cross. The first thing I do every single morning when I wake up is that I make the sign of the cross for myself, but it's a very different version. My morning offering is this, volunteering, incarnating, being born, and being ordained. So that's for me is the cross I start off with every single morning. I realize I wake into consciousness and I realize I volunteered to be here, I incarnated, I was born and I was ordained. So volunteering was saying to God, Hineni, here I am, Lord. And Nancy sang that for us this morning, very, very beautiful. Here I am, Lord. It is I, Lord. When God said, whom shall I send? And every single one of us said, here I am. I volunteer to hold your people in my heart. And then we incarnated the second part of it. So volunteering, incarnating. So we accept this interdimensional descent by incarnating. And then the third part, being born. This birth is the full commitment to the three-dimensional body. Because occasionally a soul will join with a fetus and then change its mind, and decide to be miscarried. And so being born is the full commitment to the three-dimensional body. And baptism, in a sense, is done, I believe baptism is done in the waters of the womb. And the later social ceremony is merely for the community. It is the seal of the preconception contract between two souls, one of whom, the mother, agrees to be the conduit, and the other, the child, who agrees to be the fruit of that. And then the fourth piece is being ordained. And this is not a ceremony led by a bishop in a church, but rather it is the adult conscious commitment to the mission. And that's what the word perfection means. We think that perfection is a kind of a stainless steel sinlessness. It has nothing got to do with that. Perfection in the New Testament, it comes from the word telos, from which we get the English word teleology. And teleology means to be committed to a purpose, to be attracted toward a goal, so that everything I do right now is predicated on whom I want to become or where I want to arrive at. So perfection has nothing got to do with the avoiding sin. It has to do with the courage to pick myself up again and again and again, no matter how many times I've fallen, and be radically committed to the purpose for which I incarnated. So the ordination for me then is done in the sacred silence of the soul. And then it is the ministry for the community. Every single one of us is a priest. I say that to you every Sunday as we celebrate Eucharist. Every single one of us is a priest. So for me, there are some of the symbols of the cross when I think about it. I want to talk about then different versions of symbolisms of the spiral. I want to talk firstly about spirals in art, in mathematics, and in nature. I'm sure you've seen this beautiful painting of Vincent van Gogh called Starry Night, in which Van Gogh is using swirling spiral shapes in the sky. And it's to convey movement and emotion. And in fact, you look at his work, spirals are a very prominent feature of his work. So he's talking about movement within the painting and emotions kind of brought forth by the painting. If you study mathematics, the Fibonacci series, you're going to find it all throughout nature. The Fibonacci series is a series of mathematical terms. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 35, etc. Where every subsequent number is generated by adding the two previous ones. So 1 plus 1 is 2, 1 and 2 is 3, 2 and 3 is 5, 3 and 5 is 8, etc. And this is just that is not just a weird mathematical formulation, it's actually how very, very often the petals and the seeds of flowers are actually arranged. For example, if you look at the sunflower seed, you take a sunflower, it's arranged in a Fibonacci series, in a spiral pattern, so that as they grow, they optimize the space and the growth efficiency. So it has a practical purpose as well as having a mathematical foundation. You look at other parts of nature, hurricanes and other cyclonic storms have a spiral shape. So the wind spirals inward towards the center of low pressure, and this spiral is caused by something called the Coriolis effect, where the rotation of the Earth influences the directions of the winds. So hurricanes are spirals. Even entire galaxies, the Milky Way galaxy is a spiral galaxy. So these galaxies have kind of a flat rotating disk, but there's a bulge in the center. And all the stars and the gases and the dust, they form spiral arms that curve outwards from the center. And it's done by the gravitational pull of the center, and at the same time, the rotation of the galaxy, and they create the spiral shape. And maybe most interesting of all is the DNA itself. The double helix of the DNA is a spiral. And this spiral shape is crucial for the way genetic information is stored and replicated in living organisms. And so spirals are a hugely, vastly important part of the cosmos in which we live, and the cosmos that lives inside us in our DNA. And being raised as a Celt, spirals are hugely important in Celtic cosmology. So the spirals hold a very significant meaning in Celtic art, symbolizing a variety of concepts such as eternity, or growth, or interconnectedness, or the cycles of life. And you see them very often in ancient Celtic designs, particularly in jewelry and in manuscripts and in stone carvings. So the oldest site in Ireland, in some sense, a Neolithic site, is in Newgrange in Ireland. And Newgrange is a prehistoric monument that's much, much older than the pyramids. They go back at least to 3200 before the Common Era. And these spirals are believed to have a spiritual or an astronomical significance, possibly linked to the sun or to the passage of time. So it's right there in the central monument of Ireland. Maybe the most famous Irish book of the Celts you've all heard of is the Book of Kells. And the Book of Kells is a famous illuminated manuscript created by Celtic monks somewhere around the 9th century. And it's full of intricate spiral patterns. And these spirals often symbolize the infinite nature of the divine, as well as the spiritual growth and transformation. So they're not just kind of, as we say in Swahili, maridadi. They're not just kind of trying to work on a manuscript. They have a significance all of their own. The Celtic cross as well is a spiral. Very, very often, it's a Christian symbol that often incorporates spirals in the arms of the cross and around the center. So these spirals represent eternity with no beginning and no end, and are thought to signify the endless love of God or the eternal cycles of life and death. And when you look at Celtic jewelry, many pieces will have, whether they're rings or brooches or pendants, feature a spiral design. Maybe the most famous one of all is called the Tara brooch, and it's a very famous example of Celtic metalwork from about the 7th century. And the spirals on the brooch have a symbolic meaning, possibly representing the sun, or growth, or the flow of life itself. And there's a very famous cross in a place called Clonmacnoise, which is an ancient monastic system. And it features crosses that incorporate spirals in their design. So these crosses are an excellent example of the blending of the Christian and the Celtic motifs. So when Christianity came to Ireland sometime in the first 400 years, they blended Christian iconography with Celtic ones. But I want to get onto something now that, something I invented myself many years ago. And it's the notion of what I call asymptotic spirals. Now, you can live your life in a circle, or you can live your life in a spiral. If you live your life in a circle, you're going round and round and round, meeting the same kinds of situations and responding in exactly the same way, until finally you dig yourself into a rut. Or every time you meet a similar incident, you can operate in a spiral fashion. So you're meeting the same kind of events in your life, but you're dealing with them much more adroitly. And so it's very, very important that as we live our lives, that we attempt to live it in a spiral fashion rather than a circle fashion. Circles dig us into ruts. Spirals allow us to evolve. So to use a kind of mathematical concept, very, very simple one, you all have done, graphs in school. And basically, if you have a graph with just two axes, and say the x-axis is time, and the y-axis represents change. So there's your two axes, time and change. Now, if the graph you see is a straight line, it's telling you that the rate of change is constant. You get the same amount of change in the same amount of time. If the graph is a curve, if it's curving upwards or curving downwards, it means that the rate of change is different at different times. So it's not uniform. If a graph sweeps upwards very steeply, then you've got a huge rate of change. And if at some stage the graph goes vertical, what's happening is you're getting infinite change in zero time. And we call this a singularity. The singularity leads to a dimensional shift. When there's infinite change in zero time, then all bets are off and a brand new situation comes into being. Now, when I look at Jesus on the cross, I'm pulling the two symbols together now. For me, the seven utterances of Jesus, for me, are actually a spiral. He starts by commenting on his own physical distress. I'm thirsty. So that's the first part of it. And then he gravitates to his own mental distress. My God, why have you abandoned me? So the spiral is going upwards from the mere physical to the mental. And then the third iteration is he's aware of his family's suffering. He sees his mother and his beloved disciple and Mary of Magdala at a distance. And so now he's concerned. So this is the third iteration of the spiral. And then he's aware of one of the thieves beside him crying out for mercy, and now it's widened out beyond family. And then he's aware of the soldiers who are mocking him and separating his belongings. And now the spiral is getting even bigger and higher. And then finally it ascends to the Father. It's an asymptotic spiral. Now it just jumps off the map completely. And now there's a dimensional shift. He's in the bosom of the Father again. So in some senses, when I look at the cross then, I'm not just looking at the cross of crucifixion or even the resurrection. I'm looking at the spiral that the statements of Jesus represent while he's on the cross. I believe that the life and death cycle is an asymptotic spiral, moving us among two dimensions, the dimension of 3D and the dimension of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 ED. So every incarnation, I believe, is a part of the spiral of ascension and evolution. And enlightenment is when the incarnational spiral goes asymptotic during an earth life. Some great, avatars who, while they were actually alive, became enlightened. And so the spiral went asymptotic even while they were still incarnated. When I think of the Jesus event itself, for me, the Christ event is a singularity, an asymptotic. So was the Big Bang. So in some senses, the cosmos came into being, allegedly from nothing, out of nowhere, at no time. So this is an asymptote, where there's, a total jump in reality. I believe that black holes in space, are also, singularities. Because we know from quantum information theory that data can never be lost. They're simply just radically reconfigured. I also believe in what I'm going to call white hole in space. And I believe that the black hole and the white hole in space always go together. You never get one without the other. You never get a black hole without a white hole, and there's no white hole without a black hole. So the black holes for me is where the spiral moves inwards toward the center. And the white holes is where the spiral starts to move backwards again. And you see this in astronomy and in evolutionary shifts, both physical shifts and metaphysical shifts. So the black hole for me is it's Shiva energy. It is the shaking up of the existing configurations of information. So Shiva was the destructive force in the Hindu Trinity. Not because it destroys everything, but because it reconfigures existing configurations and creates much more complex life forms. So quantum information theory then, according to quantum mechanics, tells us that information is never lost. And the Hindus will call this the Akashic records. So for me, a white hole in space is Brahma energy. It is the reconfiguring of the shaken up information into a brand new outcome. So where the black hole has condensed, and destroyed the existing configuration, the white hole now takes the same data and creates a brand new outcome from it. So whenever a great avatar, a Buddha figure or a Jesus figure volunteers for incarnation, I believe a black hole in metaphysical space is born. When a great avatar, a Jesus, a Buddha figure, when they volunteer and say, send me, a black hole in metaphysical space is born. And the extraordinary kind of infinity of the Christ figure is shrunken down into the black hole. But when a great avatar, a Buddha or a Jesus is actually born, not just volunteers for incarnation, but is actually born, then we have a white hole in metaphysical space is born. And now it's emerging at the other side into something radically different. So this is the equivalent of, there was a very famous Belgian-Russian scientist called Ilya Prigogine, who won, I believe it was the 1979, Nobel Prize for biochemistry, with a system that he called dissipative structures. And he's trying to solve an age-old problem in science. And that is, how do you reconcile the second law of thermodynamics, entropy, which tells us that all closed systems left to their own devices run themselves down into utter chaos? How do you reconcile that with the fact that evolution is a fact, that more and more complex life forms are emerging? How can there be entropy, and evolution at the same time? And he created in his laboratory working with crystals. And what he showed was that, dissipative structures is the Shiva energy that simply disassembles existing configurations and reassembles them into different combinations. You're not adding anything, you're not subtracting anything, but you're radically evolving the thing. And the simple example I use sometimes is, if you're working on a jigsaw puzzle, a huge jigsaw puzzle, and you're 5,000 pieces, and you've been working at it now for 2 or 3 weeks, and now there are 4 or 5 holes left in the jigsaw, and there are 30 pieces left over, and no matter where you put the leftover pieces, they won't fit. And then you begin to realize that there are actually kind of bumps in the jigsaw because you've wrongly assembled. There are some pieces in places that they don't belong. And then you have to have the courage to disassemble parts of the existing jigsaw puzzle and then reassign them to different locations. And then finally, there are no holes left, there are no bumps in it, and there are no pieces left over. That is what the white hole and the black hole is about. So finally, I would say that for me, karma is an asymptotic spiral designed to make us grow in love and in the recognition of the divine essence of all beings. And so if Christ consciousness is the permanent awareness of the inner divinity of all beings, then karma is the asymptotic feedback system on that journey. Namaste, my brothers and sisters.